Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Dahman. I'm the Curator of Education at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We want to thank you for joining us for our June edition of the Second Friday Lecture. With us today is Dr. Barbara Krauthamer, who is an Associate Professor of History and the Associate Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She teaches courses on 19th century African American history, including the history of Black women's lives in the Americas. She is the author of Black Slaves, Indian Masters, Slavery, Emancipation, and Citizenship in the Native American South, and co-author, along with Deborah Willis, of Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, which was published in 2012. That book received an honorable mention in nonfiction from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, was named a Choice Top 25 Outstanding Academic Book, and received the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Nonfiction. Dr. Krauthamer is also currently working on a book about enslaved women's resistance and mobility in the era of the American Revolution. We're extremely happy that she was able to join us today via Zoom for her program entitled Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery. Dr. Krauthamer?
Great, well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I will just get started talking about my work on the history of photography, photographies of slavery and emancipation, and African American photography in particular.
Yeah.
I got started on this work because I came across the document that's on the screen now, which is a advertisement or a notice for an enslaved woman who escaped from her master in Augusta, Georgia during the Civil War. And what caught my attention was that there you can see at the top of this document that there's an image of a woman, a photographic image of an enslaved woman. And I'd never seen anything like this before. I'd seen newspaper advertisements for enslaved people who escaped, and knew that that was common, that slaveholders would place notices in newspapers advertising for the capture and return of an enslaved person. But I'd never seen a notice with a photograph. And so that really caught my attention and got me started thinking about the question, what does freedom look like? This notice is from 1863 from Augusta, Georgia. The woman pictured here was a woman named Dolly, who was owned by a man named Louis Manigault, who was a very prominent and prosperous plantation owner in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country. And during the war, he moved from his plantations to the city of Augusta, Georgia, and brought some of the enslaved people that he owned, he brought with him, including Dolly. And the story that he tells in this document is that Dolly escaped from the yard in his house one afternoon. He describes her, he says she's 30 years old, she has a light complexion. She says he hesitates when spoken to, that she's healthy and good looking and has a fine set of teeth. And of course, what all of this language underscores is the owner's power to inspect and define an enslaved woman, right? That he thinks she's good looking and he has inspected her teeth. And he says that it's thought that she was enticed away by a white man because she was a stranger to Augusta. And so, of course, here too, he suggests that Dolly couldn't have imagined herself as free, that she would have required somebody else to come and tell her and take her away, that she couldn't have imagined her own route to escape and to freedom. And one of the things we know from looking through the plantation records for Louis Manigault is that, in fact, this woman, Dolly, had a suitor. There was a free Black man who lived in Augusta and who had been coming clandestinely at night to court Dolly, and that the two of them had escaped together. So clearly she was able to create her own life and create her own plans for freedom and to act on them, that she didn't need a white person to come and tell her to be free or tell her to run away. So This document has survived because Louis Manigault, the man who was trying to capture Dolly, who was never captured, she escaped in 1863 and was not heard from again by the Manigault family. But he had created these documents. Clearly, he had had a photograph of Dolly taken at some point, and then he saved them after the Civil War ended, after slavery was abolished, and created a scrapbook, sort of his yearning for the days when he owned Black people as property. One of the things that's striking to me about this document and about this image is that we only know of Dolly through this story of her escape, right? And the story that somebody else has told. But we do have this picture of Dolly. So that's what got me started thinking about this question of what does freedom look like? What is it like to create a visual history of slavery and emancipation and Black people's liberation? This image of Dolly that you can see that's cut off at the shoulders here and pasted on this handwritten notice, we think it could have been an image like the next one that I'll show you, like this, an image like this daguerreotype, which was made in 1848, which depicts an enslaved woman holding her owner's child. And this was a common genre of photography in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and beyond. But during the era of slavery in the United States, it was not uncommon for families who had some means, they didn't have to be especially wealthy, but who had some means, to have these portraits made of their children, but with one of the people they owned as an enslaved person holding the baby, usually a woman, but not always. And this was a way for the slaveholding family to demonstrate both their wealth, that they had enough money, enough resources to purchase and to own an enslaved worker to take care of their child. So it was a way of demonstrating status and wealth. And it was also a way for slaveholders to create a visual narrative that slavery was not cruel or violent or dehumanizing, but that in fact it was, a so-called domestic institution, that it was kind and gentle, and that the enslaved people were well cared for and well dressed. So that was the one narrative that slaveholders sought to tell with this kind of portrait. Of course, one of the first questions that came up for me and for my co-author, Dr. Deborah Willis, was where are these women's children and families, right? We see the enslaved woman holding her owner's child, but where's her child? Where are her loved ones? What story would she have told if she could have composed the portrait of herself? And so we think that that picture of Dolly from that first slide may have been this kind of portrait where she was holding her master's child in her lap. So these kinds of images then are definitely images of visual narratives of enslavement and of women's enslavement in particular. One of the things that we wanted to do in the book, Envisioning Emancipation, was tell that story not only of how photography, which was developed in the late 1840s, allowed for visual narratives of slavery to be depicted, but also how this new photographic technology contributed to the anti-slavery movement and the campaign against enslavement and a campaign for Black people's freedom and rights as citizens, and for a broader social recognition of Black people's humanity. This image is from 1850. It's a picture of an anti-slavery convention in upstate New York, in a town called Cazenovia, New York. It's one of the earliest examples of outdoor photography. One of the reasons this is an outdoor picture is because this convention that was organized, the organizers, which included prominent men such as Frederick Douglass and Gerrit Smith, were expecting only a few dozen participants. And as it turned out, a few hundred participants showed up. So this meeting that had originally been planned to be held indoors in a church in Cazenovia had to be moved outdoors to an apple orchard. So you can see a little bit in the background here, the shadows of the trees in the orchard. And you can see here in the foreground, the bonnets of some of the women and then sort of blurred heads of other attendees. This conference was organized in the summer of 1850, in August of 1850, in response to the Fugitive Slave Act that Congress had passed that year. The Fugitive Slave Act was recognized then and now as an exceptionally draconian and harsh measure to protect the institution of slavery. In short, some of the main points of the fugitive slave law held that it was a crime to assist any enslaved person in escaping, because of course enslaved people were owned as property and were legally defined as property. So an enslaved person who escaped from their master, from their owner, tried to free themselves, was in effect committing an act of theft. And so it became a federal crime to assist someone in their escape. The law mandated that anybody who simply had knowledge of an enslaved person who had escaped was obligated under the law to report on that person, or you would be held guilty for having that knowledge and not reporting it. The law also empowered law enforcement officials to deputize citizens and effectively compel citizens to assist in the capture and re-enslavement of people who had escaped trying to free themselves. So it was an exceptionally draconian law that not only threatened those enslaved people who attempted to escape, but also made life very difficult and precarious for those African Americans who were already free. It placed them in danger of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. And if anyone is familiar with the story, the history of a man named Solomon Northup, whose story was made into a movie a few years ago. That's what happened to Solomon Northup. He was a free man in New York who was captured and sold into slavery. So many anti-slavery activists, both white and black, organized in 1850 to protest the fugitive slave law. And so what you can see here at this photograph of this anti-slavery convention that was organized to protest it is right here in the middle is Frederick Douglass, and behind him is a man named Gerrit Smith. But the two people that I want to point out are this woman here and this other woman here. These two women, these two Black women wearing very fashionable for their day plaid shawls and big lacy bonnets. These were two women named Mary and Emily Edmondson. And the Edmondson sisters had been held as slaves in Washington, D.C. They had attempted to escape with a group of about 40 other people in the spring of 1848. And there was a ship's captain who was willing to take them on the Potomac and try to help them make their way to freedom. The ship was captured after about 24 hours, and Mary and Emily Edmondson were then remanded and taken possession of by a slave trading company called Bruin and Hill, who indicated and announced that they were going to sell these two young women into New Orleans. And New Orleans was a place that was known for young women being sold as concubines, as sex slaves. And Bruin and Hill boasted that Mary and Emily were young and good looking and would fetch a very high price. Bruin and Hill operated right in the shadow of the Capitol building. So in the nation's capital. And again, there were some scenes in that movie, 12 Years a Slave, the Solomon Northup story, that too is where he is imprisoned and sold in Washington, D.C. by this slave trading firm. Mary and Emily's father, Paul, was a free man. And he made his way from Washington, D.C. to New York City, where he met with the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, another prominent abolitionist, and prevailed upon him and said, how would you feel if these were your daughters that people were threatening to sell and abuse? And the Reverend Beecher and other abolitionists held a meeting, held a church service, and raised the funds to purchase Mary and Emily Edmondson. And so on the one hand, this is a story that ends in triumph and success, that Mary and Emily are liberated from slavery. On the other hand, it should cause us a moment to pause and say, what does that mean to have someone give you your freedom? That they had to be purchased as property in order to be liberated and recognized as free people and free women. So that's another question to think about. What does freedom look like? So Mary and Emily then eventually are sponsored by other anti-slavery activists and go to upstate New York. They complete their education there, and then they become anti-slavery activists, giving speeches and participating in conferences such as this one. One of the things that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law does is it makes freedom precarious for free African Americans. Again, there's the threat of kidnapping, and there's this growing sense that even free African Americans can't enjoy the rights of freedom in the United States. And one of the things that happens is a growing number of African Americans contemplate leaving the United States, leaving the country of their birth, to emigrate, to leave, to go elsewhere. So this is the period where Canada becomes recognized as a site of refuge. And then a smaller number of Black Americans go to Liberia, to West Africa. This is a portrait, we believe, of a woman named Sarah Mcgill Russworm, made in 1854. She was the widow of a man named John Russworm, who had been born in Jamaica to an enslaved woman and an English father. His father eventually brought him to the United States. John Russworm was the first African-American graduate of Bowdoin College in Maine. He was also the co-founder of the first Black-owned newspaper in the United States. And so John Russworm and his wife, pictured here, Sarah, eventually make their way to Liberia because they become convinced that there's no future for free Black people in the United States. This picture, we believe, is a mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning picture, taken after John Russworm's death, and his widow, we think here, is probably holding a framed and encased portrait of her deceased husband. One of the things that's striking about this portrait, aside from the fact that you can see that she's dressed in mourning clothes and she has black gloves on, a black dress, although she's very nicely dressed and coiffed and wearing jewelry, so a very formal, dignified portrait. The portrait itself was made by a man named Augustus Washington. Augustus Washington was a Black man who was born free in New Jersey. He briefly attended Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and we think it was there that he learned the art and technique of making daguerreotypes of photography. He had initially opposed the idea of Black Americans having to leave the United States in order to fully enjoy their freedom. But after the passage of that 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, he also changes his mind, and he eventually leaves for Liberia with his wife and 2 children and all of his photographic equipment. And when he's in Liberia, he runs a photography studio and becomes a member of the legislature in Liberia, and eventually is appointed as a judge. So another facet of what does freedom look like for some free African Americans prior to the Civil War. Freedom looks like exile, like a voluntary exile, and having to leave the country of their birth to find safety and meaning in freedom. Once the Civil War breaks out in 1861, there's considerable debate all across the United States in halls of government and among both Black and white Americans of what will freedom look like? What will it be like when millions, right, some 4 million Black Americans are liberated from bondage? This is an image made by a New Hampshire photographer named Henry Moore. Of course, during the Civil War, the technology didn't exist to reproduce photographs in newspapers, but Northern photographers nonetheless went to the Southern states, followed the war, made photographs of the war, and then would make copies of them and sell them to Northern audiences who wanted to see what was happening. This picture from 1862 is striking to me because it's clearly a composed shot. It's meant to show agricultural work, but it's really not people who are actually at work, but people who are posed on a plantation in the South Carolina Sea Islands, just off the coast of South Carolina. You can see here and here are 2 men, and here too are 3 Black men wearing Union Army military uniforms, right, and sort of posed, holding hoes to do sweet potato farming. These are piles of sweet potatoes here, and some very typical South Carolina woven baskets here with another pile of sweet potatoes that mainly women are sorting. And here's a woman also standing at work with a hoe. And so the photograph, which is again a staged portrait of what emancipation looks like in the Sea Islands, is that it looks very uneventful, right? Black people are still at work on the plantations, right? And so it's a visual narrative that suggests that very little will change with emancipation, with the end of slavery. It's important to know that the South Carolina Sea Islands fell under Union control very early in the war. And so we're one of the first places where indeed Black Americans had the opportunity to temporarily at least claim land for themselves and work land for themselves for their own subsistence. So this portrait that's made in the South Carolina Sea Islands is again creating this visual narrative that there will be no major changes to the economic relations between Black laborers and white employers, or to the social relationship between white Americans and Black Americans. A different visual narrative, however, is this portrait, which I love, which is, we believe, a wedding portrait of 2 formerly enslaved individuals that was made in Maryland at some point during the Civil War. We're not quite sure when. Again, a man in his military uniform and a woman sort of beautifully dressed with a necklace and a fine belt. One of the things that happens during and immediately after the Civil War is that Black Americans, enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, are allowed to marry legally. During the period of enslavement, because enslaved people were held as property and not legally recognized as people, enslaved people were not able to enter legal marriages and have the legal rights of spouses, of husbands and wives, or of parents. Consequently, married couples could be sold away from each other, just as children could be sold away from their parents. So that opportunity to have a marriage legalized, right, to be recognized as a legally wed couple, and then to be recognized as the legal parents of the children, was something that was of tremendous personal and social and obviously legal importance to Black Americans. So from the perspective of Black Americans, of formerly enslaved people, this is one thing that freedom looked like, that opportunity to define your own life and your own relationship and to have control over those relationships. One of the things that happens after the Civil War, by the 1870s, after slavery is abolished in 1865, is the rise of anti-Black violence and vigilantism in the Deep South, in the former Confederacy, all over the nation to be sure. But in the 1870s, there's really a sort of wave of bloodletting and just deadly violence directed against newly freed African Americans, especially those who were attempting to redefine the economic and labor relations between Black and white Americans, Black people who were acquiring property, Black people who were seeking independence from exploitative labor relations, for Black women who did not wish to continue working for white employers, but wanted instead to take care of their families, their children. And so by 1877, we see what's called the Exoduster Movement, which was a post-Reconstruction migration of Black people from the former Confederacy, from places like Louisiana and Mississippi, who sought to leave the South in search of safety, to escape the Klan. They sought to leave the South in search of land, right? To go someplace where they could become landowners, where they could own property, and in search of autonomy and independence. And so this is a picture of Nicodemus, Kansas, one of those early all Black towns. It's a picture that was made, you can see, in 1885. And you can see groups of people standing outside the general store, and horses and wagons, and the hints of a community, right? Groups of Black people, again, very nicely dressed. We're not sure what the event was, but people gathered in public. And I think that's also an important thing to point out here, and that we'll see in some subsequent pictures as well, of one of the things that freedom looks like, and one of the aspects of freedom that's really quite meaningful for Black Americans in the post-slavery, post-Civil War era, and I think we see resonances of it today, is that ability to occupy public space safely, right? That is, to have their mobility and their presence in public space, whether it's in front of a store or in a street or in a park, not be questioned. One of the things that we know that defined the lives of enslaved people and the laws of slavery in the United States was that under slavery, Black people's mobility was questioned. Black people did not enjoy the right to move freely, but their movement was controlled by owners or local law enforcement and patrols. And in the slave states, any white person had the right to stop and question any Black person about why they were where they were, right? That they could not occupy space freely or unquestioned. And so when we see in pictures like this one of Nicodemus, of a Black community occupying public space, that's a marker of freedom, of what freedom looked like. This is a picture from 1900 from Austin, Texas. And this is a group of formerly enslaved people who have gathered to celebrate Juneteenth, right? That day in June when Union Army General Granger arrived in Texas to announce that the Civil War had ended in June of 1865, right? The war had ended in April. But Union troops did not make their way to Texas, and word of the war's end and the military presence to ensure the end of slavery didn't make its way to Texas until June. So we have Juneteenth, June 19th in particular. So this is a group of formerly enslaved people from the Austin area who gathered to celebrate, right, Emancipation Day, to celebrate Juneteenth. Black Americans had been celebrating Emancipation Day since the 1830s. In fact, in the 1830s, Free Black Americans celebrated the end of slavery in the British colonies, and the British had abolished slavery in the 1830s. So from the 1830s to the 1865, free Black Americans would celebrate the end of slavery, Emancipation Day, in the British colonies. And then after 1865, they celebrated Emancipation Day, sometimes Juneteenth celebrations, sometimes called Emancipation celebrations in the United States. This group in Austin wanted to have Juneteenth celebrations, but were not able to gather safely and freely in Austin's public parks. So the Black community in Austin, in the neighborhood of East Woods, pooled their resources to buy land to create a park that Black people could use. So again, that desire to have public space and to be able to claim public space where they could gather freely. One of the things that I think is striking about this photo, and again, thinking about Black people's self-representation and the stories or narrative that they want to tell about their lives, about their freedom, is the dignity and solemnity of this group. Right? The women are dressed beautifully, the men are dressed formally, and they have a real air of sophistication and dignity around them, which again, I think tells us the story of how Black Americans who had survived enslavement saw themselves and wanted to be seen. And that is as refined, intellectual, dignified, sophisticated property owners, right? Here's a group that pooled their resources to purchase land to create a park. So people who had gone from being owned as property to owning property. This is another emancipation celebration taken in 1905 by commercial photographers. And so this was an image that was reproduced and sold widely. This image, what's important to know about this is that this is an Emancipation Day parade and celebration in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia, of course, was the capital of the Confederacy. And so here again, we have a group, probably hundreds, perhaps thousands, it's hard to tell, of mainly African Americans dressed clearly in their Sunday best. Even, I mean, I love the children right here in the foreground in their little hats and the boys in their short pants. But everyone, you can see some women here again dressed in, you know, the fashion of their day. So everyone dressed in their Sunday best. There's someone in the middle here in regalia on a horse and claiming the streets of the former Confederacy, right? The capital of the Confederacy for their Emancipation Day celebration. And so in these celebrations, there was usually sort of a parade that was led sometimes by veterans with a band, and the group would march and then gather in a park or a town square, and they would hear public orations. People would give inspirational speeches, usually community leaders would give, you know, speeches on the political and social issues of the day that were relevant and important to the Black community in that location. And then there would be music and food, ice cream, games for the children. And so it was sort of a community day, but a day that was really in honor of emancipation and Black people's freedom. So now I want to transition to another aspect of what freedom looked like, some of which I've hinted at earlier. So freedom on the one hand, right, looked like that dignity and composure, right, and occupying public space and being able to claim public space as free people, and that ability to move freely and without question in public space. Freedom for Black women also entailed claiming a sense of dignity and beauty, and presenting that. Black women always thought of themselves as dignified, always understood themselves as beautiful, intelligent, intellectual, whole people, but they were not always recognized that way by the wider society. Certainly, we know that during slavery, the ways that Black women were abused, were forced to labor, were physically abused, right, rested on notions of Black women as less than women, not just less than human, but less than women, right, of not deserving the rights and protections and respect that were accorded to white women in the 19th century. And those racist stereotypes about Black women as less than women persisted through the 19th century. So one of the things that we see in late 19th century portrait photography, however, are Black women having their portraits made. And so this was a frequent common mode of portraiture, that a person would go and have their portrait made. This is probably a painted canvas backdrop. And then the props here of a bench and a tree, some grass. And this was a studio portrait, obviously, but meant to create, sort of a romantic vision of this beautiful young woman who's dressed in just this gloriously detailed outfit with this incredible quilted hat. You can see she's wearing a ring, she has a parasol and a corsage. I mean, she's really just dressed in the high fashion of her day. What's striking about this, of course, is that she's then conveying a narrative of herself as a refined, sophisticated, fashionable young woman. This image is in the Missouri State Archives, and the only thing we know about this young woman are the notations that were made by an archivist or librarian when the photograph was acquired. And the notation on the reverse of this card says, "Portrait of a young woman believed to be a house servant." Now we know that working as a domestic servant, as someone's maid, or in childcare, or as a cook, was the predominant occupation open to Black women in the 19th century, and indeed in the 20th century until roughly the 1960s. So it's entirely likely that she did work as someone's domestic servant. However, this is clearly not how she wanted to present herself, right? She is not presenting herself as a laborer hired by somebody else or as a subordinate to somebody else. She's presenting herself as a fashionable, sophisticated, independent, dignified young woman. So for her, what freedom looks like is that independence and that sophistication. And I think that's the story that she would tell, rather than the story of what her job was or who she worked for. I want to end with two family portraits. And I want you to think about those first pictures that I showed you of Dolly, and then that second image of the enslaved woman holding her owner's baby in her lap. And I asked the question, where were her children? Well, these are not her children literally, but this is a family portrait of a young woman and her three daughters. They were homesteaders. This woman in the center, her name was Emma Harris. And this is a portrait from the 1880s from Montana. And so again, this portrait sort of encapsulates so much of what freedom looked like for Black Americans after the Civil War, right? That this is a portrait clearly of a family, maybe older generations of the family, a decade earlier or so who had left the Deep South for Montana to homestead. And then it's a family portrait, right, in which a woman is pictured with her own children, right, rather than her owner's children or her employer's children. And again, you can see, right, the girls have on their Mary Janes, they have bows in their hair. She has her wedding ring, right? It's again, this portrait of a dignified family, right, where the family is together, that they haven't been separated, right, by the violence of slavery. And now in this post-emancipation era, right, that they're able to own property rather than be owned as property, and they're able to have their family together. And so this last picture, we think is probably from the 1880s as well. This is a photograph of a woman named Mrs. Minerva Graves, who's photographed with her two young grandchildren, Wallace and Perry Billingsley. And the reason I like to end with this photograph is that Mrs. Graves had been enslaved in Georgia. So she'd been born into slavery. The laws of slavery held that if an enslaved woman gave birth to a child, the child was born a slave and was owned by the mother's owner, regardless of who the father was. So Mrs. Graves here was born into slavery in Georgia. She lived through the Civil War. She was emancipated after the Civil War when slavery was abolished in 1865. But she's pictured here with her two young grandsons who were born free. And I often think about how powerful an experience that must have been for her, to sit with her grandchildren and know that they were born free. They were born legally as the children of their parents rather than the property of an owner. And what a powerful experience that must have been for her, to sit with these two young children, her grandchildren who had been born free, and know that her family's history could now be a history of freedom rather than a history of enslavement, and that she could have that documented in this photograph, that she could sit with her grandchildren and tell a story about her family that was now a story of freedom rather than one of bondage. And so I think this, for me at least, really hits home that that story of slavery is a generational one that we carry in our families, but the story of freedom and the power of what that freedom can mean to the individuals and to the society is also encapsulated in this photograph. So I'll end here and thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to receiving questions from you.
Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing these amazing images with us. Do you have time to answer a quick question that I have, and that might get the ball
I
rolling
sure
for our
do.
audience? Now, I
Sure.
want to let everyone know that these images come from a book that you co-authored with Deborah Willis entitled Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, which was published in 2012. Just where did you find these amazing images? And can you talk a little bit about the research and the repositories and the different places that I'm sure that you scoured to find these images, not only that you showed for us today in the presentation, but also that you published within the book?
Sure. So the book, right, has about 175 to 200 images in it that we collected mainly from libraries and archives all over this country. There were a couple that we had hoped to get from England. And then I think in the end, the English archives were charging a much higher reproduction price. But so some are from Library of Congress, some are from the National Archives in Washington, DC. This one of Minerva Graves is from the Georgia State Archives. So a lot of state archives, some university archives, And then there are one or two that came from private collections that people let us reproduce. But at the time, when we started doing this research, which again really started when I saw that image of Dolly on a research trip in South Carolina. And then there's a very famous portrait by the photographer Richard Avedon that was made in 1963, and that's also in the book. And that portrait that was made in 1963 was of a man who was almost 100 years old, so had been born just before the Civil War, as an enslaved person. And I saw that photograph in an exhibit in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and almost fell on the floor that I'd never read or heard anything about it. And so we just sort of, asked around, called every library, looked, and at the time, people were not really interested in photographs of slavery and emancipation. So it took a lot of detective work, but once we got going, we found them.
Yeah, it's amazing that these photographs are out there and that you were able to canvas really all over the United States, not just going to National Archives or the Library of Congress. You were able to kind of do a nationwide search, and I think it's a good lesson for all of us that these images exist all over the United States, and there's how many of these remain unknown, hidden away, maybe in a library or an archive. And I'm hopeful that maybe this presentation or this talk will inspire people to go out and take a look at maybe in their own collections or their own community and find these, because they are such powerful visual reminders of this history.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And it's been nice over the past 6 or 7 years now of seeing more attention to these photographs. And as you said, right, people find them sometimes in attics of old houses, or antique stores.
Yeah. Well, we thank you so much for doing the program for the second Friday lecture. This was amazing, and I'm so glad we were able to connect up using this technology. It's had its limitations, and it's certainly been, we wish we were more in person and we were able to do these live for our live audience. But I guess the silver lining in all of this, that's allowed us to make these connections and bring historians like yourself to our audience here in Kenosha. We can't thank you enough for spending a portion of your day with us, and we look forward to staying in touch and possibly working with you in the future.
Yes, I'd like that. Thanks again for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks so much, everyone. We look forward to our July 2nd Friday lecture. Stay tuned and keep your eye on the Civil War Museum website and Facebook pages for more upcoming talks and programs as we move forward in the summer of 2021. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye.